We'll just start off. It's obvious that climate change is a concern for both the insured and the insurance industry. And just a couple of little headline things. Ernst & Young, in a study about 2 years ago called Climate Change, the number one risk, long-term, far-reaching. Swiss Re recently said that they thought that the climate change lawsuits would move much more quickly than the asbestos-related claims, and we are seeing more and more climate change-related litigation all the time. And then about a year ago, the chairman of our company called climate change the number one risk of the 21st century. As insurance brokers, as a little bit of explanation given by Rowan earlier, we're in the unique position of being able in situations like this to talk to insurance companies and get their perspective, what they're doing to respond to the risks that our clients and their clients are dealing with. And then we talk to the companies that have large portfolios of real estate, manufacturing locations, and we find out what concerns them. And kind of there in our intermediary role, it's an interesting place to be because we see a couple different perspectives. So there's a very broad range of risks that are faced by insurance companies and the people that are buying the insurance that they have to offer. And what is typically viewed as kind of the most common and immediate risk is the physical risk that we just talked about. And it's very very costly and very dramatic. So it's with very good reason that that's kind of the first thing that we always go and focus on. And there's documented impacts and predictions of significant future impacts. If a number was brought up earlier, but if you look at the 2005 U.S. hurricane season, 2 major hurricanes, this morning there was made mention of the ice loss in Greenland. And just in 2007, lost enough ice that it could make a water layer a half a mile deep over all of D.C. There's estimates that by the year 2050, we will encounter $300 billion in annual losses. And a report that just came out said that in the Asian coastal megacities, and if you think about that, it's an area where there's the greatest economic growth and certainly huge populations. And they're predicting that by 2050, 60% of the population will be impacted by extreme weather events, where that number today is just 26%. So, in a 40-year period, there's anticipated to be a huge change. So, just to put some perspective on the physical risk in the U.S., the insured coastal values are huge. And if you look at this, everybody immediately thinks of Florida, and for good reason. There's been a lot of hits there, and it sits, right between the Atlantic and the Gulf. But if you look at this in the context of the potential Northeast exposures, the potential impact in this area is staggering, and these are even numbers that are a few years old. But kind of the nightmare scenario, and I first used this graphic 2 years ago. I think Lindine's seen this before. But this past summer there was one storm that appeared to be on a path to fulfilling this nightmare. There's a lot of people that feel that it's inevitable that due to the anticipated increased ferocity of storms and the warming of the Atlantic, that this will happen. And if you just think about the insured values in that area, it could be staggering. And it has happened before, not in very recent years, but the problem is there's much more development in this area, and unlike the Gulf Coast, where you do have a lot of natural seashore, they've put a lot of coastal wetlands back in place to help absorb the force of the storm. We really don't have that in the Northeast. And while the physical risk, the property value risk is huge, it's not just the physical risk. We have a very dense population in this area. You have business interruption concerns, and then the ensuing litigation associated with an extreme weather event that could be linked to climate change. So just overall on the climate change risk, I think, identifying and quantifying the risk is a challenge because it comes from so many different perspectives and the size is potentially so large. We're seeing litigation increase, and it's predicted that it will continue to increase, and the defense costs are huge. I said that the scope is the planet. I think that presents two challenges. One is just the enormity of the problem, and two is when you get into a litigation situation, how do you assign blame, or how do you decide what somebody is actually liable for when you're thinking about something that affects the whole planet. Significant unknowns, so there's so many unknowns, and every time Lindine and I speak together I bring this up, but I think 2 years ago she and I were on a panel together and she said, somebody said, well, what's your bottom line on this? And she said it will be a year of uncertainty. And we're into year 3, I guess. But one thing we do know for sure is insurance is not the total answer, and that's what we tell our clients when they ask us, for our advice. Why is it that it's not the total answer? Well, first, because the physical loss potential and the litigation impact potential is huge. As I mentioned before, it's not just the physical risks, and you've got everything from some things that were discussed this morning, risks to existing business models, ecosystem risks, and the coverage availability, I believe, will change as these losses develop. And so, when our clients start to talk to us about this, we say what you really need to do is identify your risks and then see how you can control those risks, because you really shouldn't be looking to just insurance to, insure away your problems. We've already hit on the physical risk. Litigation risk, there's two primary sources of that. One is suits brought against the emitters of greenhouse gases and, going against them for damages as a result of the effects of climate change. And now the one that's really emerging is business groups fighting the increased regulation that is occurring in the absence of cohesive federal legislation here in the U.S. Now, I just saw an article that said that between 2006 and 2007, the number of climate change-related suits doubled. And then between 2009 and 2010, that's expected to triple. So, we all know how expensive it is to defend a lawsuit, especially when it's environmental in nature. I think competitive risk is very important, and things will change. Industries will change their processes, their practices, and they need to be prepared for that. Reputation risk, whether it's real or perceived, is an impact from shareholders, consumers. We mentioned the regulatory and legislative risk. There is a lot of uncertainty because we're at a stalemate on legislation. So with that and with where we have been, we're moving forward with regulation, and that is really just serving to create a lot of uncertainty, especially when we've got people in Congress saying, no way are we going to have cap and trade, but the president is still saying, I want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 17% by 2020. So it's a real struggle, and especially with what was just announced last week, and the EPA moving toward, giving permits for large emitters. It's going to get more interesting. Viability risk of populated areas. in presentations in the keynote this morning, they talked about adaptation planning, financial risk, and finally, understanding the science. And I won't try to get too much into this because Rowan could talk about it much better than I could, but it's important to understand what's happening, why it's happening, and what the future expectations are. And while this is typically used by insurance companies, I think it's also important for our insureds to take this into consideration and begin to try to get some of this information to just gain a better understanding of what's happening and how they could be impacted. As far as why focus on regulation, legislation, and litigation, we've talked about the legislation stalemate, the regulation in the absence of that. There's the EPA greenhouse gas reporting that started earlier this year. There's a lot of people that are very concerned about that because they wonder what those numbers will be used for. Also earlier this year, SEC issued interpretive guidance on climate change risk disclosure. That was very troubling to a lot of people because one of the lawsuits out there, the Kivalina suit, the way that the defendants in that suit were selected is they had made statements in their annual reports that they knew they had climate change liability. They knew they had greenhouse gas emission issues that were a concern to them. And those were the companies that were pulled in to that suit. So, you add to that the lawsuits and how those tend to over time establish the scope of liability for third-party actions. And these regulations and litigation drive insurance product development. And the two that immediately come to mind when I think about that is environmental insurance and D&O insurance. Those all kind of grew because of lawsuits and regulations changing the way we looked at risk. Directors and officers insurance.
It's to protect the. You can, as a director of a company, you can buy insurance to protect yourself against people suing you for some of your actions, at least.
Yeah, for your management or mismanagement.
Not everything. Let's be reasonable here.
So I think when our clients ask us what to do, what they should be thinking about, we tell them to begin by considering the.
I'm going to have to ask you to move fairly quickly because I'll be given we've got a couple more speakers to go. So
okay.
You can sort of
I can move through these very quickly.
Very quickly, I'll be very grateful.
New risks and the magnitude of existing risks, and then different ways to manage the risk. And what we've been telling people is strategic response is no longer optional. It's something that needs to happen. And in fact, this has been called a textbook example of the need for ERM or enterprise risk management. And all major insurance brokers have ERM capabilities. It's different approaches, different tools, different outputs. But it is a tool that can help companies identify what risks they have, establish the probability, and look at how different controls could impact that, and then prioritize the risks and establish mitigation strategies. So that's one thing that we're telling people, because it seems to be there's so many risks out there, people have a hard time focusing in on what's going to be the biggest risk to their organization and where they should focus their activities. And for that reason, I think this is a good approach. There's certainly insurance products out there that can be used to help mitigate the risk. Lindine's going to talk about that. And I guess if I had to sum it up and saying of one positive that I see out of all of this, and it was mentioned briefly this morning, is that it has elevated environmental up to a very high level because of climate change concerns and the potential enormity of the impacts.
Thank you, Rick.
That's it. Thank you.